They told her it would be the happiest day of her life. But as the church bells rang and the veil was lowered, she knew, deep down, she might not survive the night. In medieval Europe, a wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a battlefield dressed in silk, where vows were chains, kisses were weapons, and the bride was often the first casualty. Tonight, we open the forgotten pages of history and step into the dark halls where "I do" was whispered with trembling lips. Because what if I told you that surviving your own wedding was the rarest miracle of all? You may never look at a white dress the same way again. They called it a celebration. But behind the perfumed veils, the ringing bells, and the echo of lutes in the cold stone halls, weddings in medieval Europe were often something far darker. A carefully dressed masquerade of fear, violence, and fatal obligation that required luck, silence, and a spine of iron beneath a gown of silk. The bride, barely more than a child, was chosen not for love, but for blood. These were her weapons, or her shackles. Papal dispensations could be bought like spices in a market. There were rumors, always rumors, of brides who vanished in the night, their gowns found beside rivers, of poisoned chalices lifted in trembling hands, of weddings where the groom died in his sleep and the widow's tears were dry before dawn. To marry was to gamble with your body, your soul, your life. For in the shadow of every wedding candle, death waited patiently. And yet the bells kept ringing. The guests kept dancing. And the brides kept walking down aisles, lined with the ghosts of those who came before. That was the darkest fate of all. Consanguinity, the sin of marrying too close, was a tool, a blade. What was blessed on Monday could be condemned by Friday, depending on whose purse was heavier. In such a world, a wedding was not a joy. It was a battlefield where every smile could be a threat, every toast a hidden insult. She was the prize, and the prisoner. She learned quickly to keep her eyes lowered, to speak little, to walk carefully between power and pity. Her husband might be drunk before dusk, eager to assert his rights beneath the gaze of guests. And if he were brutal, or mad, or cursed, the church would remind her that it was her cross to bear. Marriage was indissoluble, a chain that tightened with each sunrise. Her future was negotiated in smoke-filled chambers, where men with cold eyes and ink-stained fingers sealed her fate with wax and whispers. Sometimes, she hadn't yet bled. Sometimes, she had barely spoken her first full prayer. But still, she was betrothed. Because property, whether a castle, a field, or a daughter, must be bound before others lay claim. A wedding was rarely a union of hearts. More often, it was the execution of a contract. Imagine her, pale as bone, standing before the church altar with her hands trembling in gloves too large. Her groom, twice her age, or thrice, perhaps a knight with a scarred face and blood beneath his nails, not just of ancestors, though they hung heavy in tapestries and genealogy scrolls. But ghosts, a wrong toast, a poorly placed guest, an unpaid dowry, or simply a look, too long, too soft, exchanged between a bridesmaid and the wrong man. These could unravel a wedding like a curse sewn into the hem of a bridal train. In Burgundy, 1321, a groom was murdered by his bride's cousin before the final dance. A dispute over inheritance, masked as a quarrel over spilled wine. In northern Italy, records speak of a noblewoman poisoned on her wedding night, not by her enemies, but by her mother, who feared consummation would reveal a terrible secret. And in a small Saxon village, tales still linger of a wedding that ended with the church roof collapsing mid-ceremony. Locals said it was divine punishment, but whispers told of arson and the bride's unwillingness to kneel. And so, one must ask, was marriage a beginning, or a burial with music? Or worse, a noble whose reputation, spoken only in hushed tones, her family, smiling tightly, watched her vanish beneath the weight of lace and expectation. And then came the feast. Ah, the feast. The great mask of joy, where roast piglets dripped fat from its mouth, where goblets overflowed with wine dark as blood, where laughter grew louder than the bride's silence. But beneath the noise, something rotten festered. Because every wedding in the Middle Ages invited ghosts. Even the church, that great guardian of holy union, could offer no real sanctuary. But not all brides accepted silence. Some, in secret corners of cold keeps, plotted. In medieval Europe, refusing a wedding wasn't just a matter of saying no. It was a declaration of war. A woman who resisted the marital chain became a living scandal, a blemish upon her family's name. A whisper passed between merchant wives at dawn markets and murmured behind altar screens. He dragged her from the rose beds, ignoring her pleas and her tears, and threw her into the manor's ice cellar. Some say it was a seizure. Others spoke of wolfsbane tea, served by trembling hands. But the cause was never proven, and Lady Amlet was sent to a convent where she died unnamed. Yet her story did not die. It clung to the stones of that crumbling manor in Lorraine, weaving itself into local lore. Kitchen corners and stables alike buzzed with her tale, a whispered warning to any girl who dreamed of resisting her father's wishes. There once existed a darkness that we've thankfully consigned to the past. There she spent 5 long days, slowly losing her mind, dreaming of spring and whispering her curse, until her father grew weary of the wails echoing through the stone halls. The guest list alone was a minefield. Imagine being invited to a wedding in the Middle Ages, after the priest did his thing. The newlyweds were paraded to their room, not exactly in a romantic way. It was more like a public display with family, friends, and sometimes servants egging them on. The whole affair was meant to ensure the bride's virginity, or at least the appearance of it. If there was no blood on the sheet, well, rumors spread faster than wildfire. The bride's reputation was ruined. For noble women especially, the virginity thing wasn't just tradition. It was a matter of currency. Blood on the sheet was proof of a sealed contract, a transaction completed. No blood. Well, that could bring shame on families, shatter alliances, and mess up inheritance. You'd have to tread carefully, because who you decided to snub, or be snubbed by, could have serious repercussions. There were even stories of doppelgangers hired to take the bride's place. These tales, passed down through songs and whispers, are like fragments of a secret language. They speak of a time when weddings were less about love and more about power, when the night of consummation was a public ordeal. In a world where women's bodies were scrutinized and judged, these stories become all the more potent. They echo the silent screams of countless women, the desperation of a system that sought to control not just their bodies. The bride and groom didn't just exchange vows, they put on a display. Who was invited? Who sat where? What gifts they brought? Even how much they spent on clothes, all of it was a statement. Then he hauled her out, frostbitten and broken, only to dress her in layers of silk and escort her to the church. Her protests were ignored, her cries drowned out by the murmur of the crowd. She was shoved into a sedan chair and carried away, first to the home of her fiancé, then to the altar. Though her spirit was crushed, her body remained a vessel of defiance. She refused to accept the marriage bed, choosing instead to lie on a cold stone hearth. Intervened, offering her one final choice: accept the marriage bed or face the annulment that would bring shame on her and her family. And so, shivering and sobbing, she allowed herself to be led to the bedroom. Though whether she understood what had transpired is a matter of debate. In noble houses, her refusal could undo years of alliance building. In peasant villages, it could provoke open violence. And in both, it made her body a target. This was the world that 15-year-old Lady Hamlet de Vigny stepped into when she uttered 3 fateful words. Hear me out. Her father, Lord Thibaut, had promised her hand in marriage to the son of a neighboring baron. A man twice, her father's age. At the time, Hamlet was but a child, betrothed to an adult. Now, a wedding was fast approaching, and her family prepared for the influx of relatives and retainers. But Hamlet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coming winter. She dreaded her fate, a life with a stranger, the raising of children, the endless cycle of bearing heirs and bearing witness to her husband's So as her mother fussed over veils and finery, Hamlet retreated to the garden, and there, in the quiet rustle of leaves, she poured out her fear and loathing. "God damn the day," she cried, "that I must wed a butcher in silk." Little did she know that those very words would become her epitaph. For as soon as her father heard her words, he flew into a rage. What is known is that 2 weeks later, her new husband was found dead in his sleep. As you can probably tell, weddings weren't just about love and commitment back then. It was a show of power, wealth, and lineage. And let's not forget the bedding ceremony, a truly bizarre spectacle. There were tricks, though, little acts of defiance. Brides-to-be concocted mixtures to stain the sheets beforehand. And while history remembers few of these women by name, their stories linger in the cracks of our collective memory, reminding us that beneath the gaiety of weddings, beneath the celebration of love. Thanks for watching. In the grim tapestry of medieval Europe, a woman's worst nightmare began, not with the vows. For when the festivities were done, when the wine had run dry and the music faded into memory, something far more sinister took root. King Henry and Queen Isabella are celebrating the marriage of their eldest daughter, the beautiful and intelligent Joanna, to the dashing Duke. The wedding night ends not in bloodshed or shame. That did not mean the danger had passed. In truth, the ceremony was merely the overture. The true terror of marriage in medieval Europe began after the feast was forgotten, after the guests had departed, after the candles had burned down 2 stubs. For that was when the bride was no longer a daughter or a symbol, but property and possession demanded obedience. Once wed, a woman's name was not her own. Her body, her land, even her words became the legal extension of her husband. Her testimony was worth less in court. Her complaints, if heard at all, were filtered through the veil of patriarchal mercy. She became, in the eyes of the world, half a person, half alive, half buried in the will of another. And if she resisted, there was no escape, no law to protect her, no church willing to hear her confession unless it ended in silence. Let me tell you of Clara of Ulm, a merchant's daughter of sharp mind and sharper tongue. Clara was seen once, standing in the market with a bruise like a plum beneath her eye. When a priest inquired, her husband claimed she had fallen, but the bruises kept appearing, down her arms, across her back. She stopped attending Mass. Then, one morning, her house was empty. Her husband claimed she'd run. Her family mourned her, though her grave was empty. Years later, bones were found in the butcher's cellar, small, wrapped in a wedding dress. No charges were brought. This was not rare. Marriage granted men the power of kings within their walls. Abuse was not only permitted, it was expected if it preserved obedience. A husband could strike, imprison, even starve his wife if he believed it was for her moral or spiritual correction. And many believed that pain drew women closer to God. That suffering was the feminine path. There were worse fates still. Marriages used for punishment, for humiliation. In France, certain towns imposed forced unions between criminals and social outcasts. One recorded case speaks of a thief, missing 3 fingers, wedded to a prostitute accused of witchcraft. They were paraded through the village in iron chains, jeered by children, married beneath a banner that read 2 devils made one. Neither was seen again a year later. And then there was hunger. In times of famine, when crops failed and rats grew fat on plague-ridden corpses, a wedding was not joy. Poor families would offer their daughters to older men, cruel men, men who owned a second loaf of bread. Girls were traded like barley. Brides wept not because they were leaving their families, but because they had not been chosen by worse. To be a wife in these times meant the difference between a roof and a ditch, between soup and starvation. And yet, even in nobility, where tapestries covered stone walls and musicians played at every meal, safety was not guaranteed. Consider the case of Lady Isolde of Brienne, a widow of great wealth, married at 80, a warlord whose victories were matched only by his appetite for control. Their wedding was grand, 50 courses, 10 jesters, a tower of sugar shaped like the Virgin Mary. But within a year, she was never seen without a hood. Within 2, she had ceased speaking entirely. Rumors whispered of locked doors, of guards stationed outside her chambers. Some claimed she'd gone mad. Others that she was merely obedient. When Alaric died of apoplexy, Isolde emerged with her mouth sewn shut, not by thread, but by habit. She never remarried. The tragedy of marriage in the Middle Ages was not always written in screams. Often, it was quiet, a slow erosion of identity, of laughter, of hope. Women became shadows, moving through corridors, figures in windows, names on gravestones, followed only by the phrase wife of, and yet, somehow, life continued. Babies were born, mothers sang lullabies, and brides still walked down aisles. Because what else could they do? Refuse and face exile, submit and vanish slowly. For many, there was no path to freedom, only survival. And even that was a miracle. A wedding, in such a world, was not a celebration of love. It was a rite of transformation, one that too often turned a woman into a ghost long before her death. The bride, no longer a beloved daughter or a cherished maiden, became a possession. Her agency, her voice, even her very identity were taken from her, leaving her to navigate a world where she was no longer a person. Let me spin this tale of unease for you. Picture this: a grand feast, the clinking of tankards, the murmur of well wishes. Medieval weddings were brutal affairs. They were orgies of crushing expectations, deadly rituals, and horrifying diseases. In many kingdoms, betrothals occurred before the age of 10. There are records, scattered like feathers in the margins of monastic texts, of couples who loved despite their fate. Entire wars were avoided or ignited with a wedding. The fate of nations rested on a bride's smile, a groom's seed. That was why noble weddings were drenched in spectacle, to disguise the terror behind velvet and gold. The wedding of Prince Matthias of Bohemia, to Lady Gertrude of Mainz. One choked on a jeweled plum. Another was crushed under a collapsing tapestry. 2 died in a duel over who would pour the wine. And the bride herself fainted during the final mass, her corset so tight her ribs fractured. No one considered canceling the union. because weddings were not personal. They were sacred obligations to history itself. And if someone died, whether servant or spouse, it was chalked up to divine will, and who were mortals to question it? A farmer's daughter who married for kindness, not coin. In villages, stories of cursed brides and haunted weddings spread like wildfire. A bride whose veil caught flame was said to bring misfortune for 7 years. A groom who forgot to wear blue might die before the harvest. Superstition curled around every rite, not because people were foolish, but because they were desperate for control. In a world where marriage could kill you, belief was armor. Thus emerged the wedding charms. Pouches of herbs stitched into hems, coins tied to garters, prayers whispered into wine. In Wales, some brides chewed elderbark to protect against possession. In Poland, grooms wore garlic under their tunics. In the Alps, there are still tales of brides who walked backward down the aisle to confuse spirits trying to steal their soul. A knight who defied his liege and wed the scullery maid he adored. It was random, arbitrary, a matter of whose rage boiled over first, of whether the groom's wine had been tampered with, of whether the bride could scream loud enough to be heard. So, when a wedding ended without death, disgrace, or disappearance, it was remembered, not as joy, but as miracle. People spoke of it in taverns with wonder. Did you hear? Lady Mirabelle wed the Lord of Rooksworth and lived. And those words, and lived, carried more weight than any title, any dowry, any kiss. Because, in medieval Europe, a wedding wasn't just the risk of heartbreak. It was the risk of obliteration. They were punished, of course. Cast out, disinherited, whipped, imprisoned. But they existed. And when the world was silent, you could still find the carved initials on old oaks. The poems hidden in chapel corners, the lockets buried beneath floorboards. The marriage would be formalized later, but the commitment, political, financial, spiritual. A little girl might not know how to read, but she would be taught the name of her husband, repeated to her like a prayer. And when the time came, she would be handed over a gift wrapped in silk and silence. One such girl was Eleanor of Anjou, married at 12 to a nobleman 30 years her senior. On the night of her wedding, she was dressed in white fox fur and led through a corridor lined with torches. Her husband kissed her hand, smiled, and turned to the crowd. "A rosebud now," he said, "but she will bloom." She never did. Eleanor died 3 weeks later of internal bleeding. The physician said nothing. The court poet composed a sonnet in her memory. It was titled "The Bride Who Slept Too Long." The grief of these weddings, when it was allowed to exist, was always decorative, performed, stylized, just another layer of ritual. Mothers wept not because their daughters were gone, but because it was expected. Fathers drank, not to forget, but to celebrate that their property had changed hands successfully. Yet, For all its horrors, the medieval wedding did not collapse under the weight of its own cruelty. It endured, because it served a purpose far greater than affection or union. A wedding was not for the couple, it was for the bloodline, for the land, for the church. It was the most sacred of bargains. Flesh traded for favor, wombs offered as soil for dynasties, and everyone, from the king to the beggar, played their part in this ancient, brutal theater. The most tragic of players were the young, the child brides and grooms whose faces could barely hold the weight of a crown or a ring. But sometimes, just sometimes, love did try to live in the cracks. And yet, for each forbidden love, there were 100 forced pairings, couplings arranged to bind lands, settle debts, or end feuds. Behind this divine theater was a darker truth still, the power of rumor. And yet, all this was not enough. For in the end, survival was not promised by ritual or virtue. They say, time buries everything, but not the screams hidden beneath wedding bells, not the blood beneath the lace, and not the eyes, those silent, haunted eyes that peer out from fading tapestries, from old frescoes in crumbling chapels, from bridal portraits whose smiles never reach their eyes. Even now, centuries later, we can still feel the weight of those unions. But perhaps that's why her story survived, because people needed to believe that escape was possible. And silence wraps around the bones of the past, you can still hear the truth echo. That surviving a wedding in medieval Europe ... was not a given. It was not a blessing. It was a miracle bought in blood. That a woman could survive the altar and the bed and still keep her soul intact. Because survival, in those days, was rebellion. Even the architecture betrayed them. The very churches where vows were spoken were often cold. Windowless tombs, where saints bled from stone eyes, and crucifixes. The same cloth used to cover the dead, and the music, the music lied most of all. Harps and lutes, flutes and bells, all played to muffle the truth. That this was not celebration, it was sentencing. And the worst part, no one called it evil. No one screamed. No one stopped it. Because it was tradition. Because it was God's will. Because it was always done this way. But just beneath the surface, in the songs of old witches and the warnings of midwives, in the trembling of a girl's hands before she took the first step down the aisle, the fear lived on. It whispered in every generation. It carved itself into every myth of maidens locked in towers, of queens gone mad. We call them fairy tales now. But once, they were histories. The air in certain ruins remains heavy, as if still echoing with vows spoken through clenched teeth. In dusty archives, marriage contracts read like ledgers of possession. And in lullabies passed from mother to daughter, the warnings linger, soft but sharp. Or do not marry at all. The medieval wedding was never truly about love. It was an altar built on fear. An altar where women were sacrificed not to gods, but to lineage. And every gesture, the placing of the ring, the lifting of the veil, the breaking of the bread, they always smiled. Because that was the final mask. Dignity in defeat. The rare few who survived, not just the ceremony, but the years that followed. Some became cold, calculating queens of ice who learned to wield their husband's power with deadly precision. Others retreated into piety, cloistered away behind stone walls where no man could touch them again. And some ... simply faded. Their names lost to time. Their faces blurred by generations. But every so often, history remembers one. There is one record faded, near illegible, of a woman known only as the widow of Ashk. She survived 4 weddings. Her first husband died from a fall during the feast. Her second vanished in a war. Her third drank poison. Some say by accident, some say not. Her fourth lived 20 years and died peacefully in bed. She outlived them all, and in her final years, she was asked what she had learned about marriage. She replied with a single line, "I learned that the candle always burns the moth. The moth becomes flame first. It is a beautiful lie, of course." Most were burned before they ever had the chance to ignite. And maybe, just maybe, in the distant dark, where candlelight flickers on stone walls, they told her it would be the happiest day of her life. But as the church bells rang and the veil was lowered, she knew, deep down, she might not survive the night. In medieval Europe, a wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a battlefield dressed in silk, where vows were chains, kisses were weapons, and the bride was often the first casualty. Tonight, we open the forgotten pages of history and step into the dark halls where "I do" was whispered with trembling lips. Because what if I told you that surviving your own wedding was the rarest miracle of all? You may never look at a white dress the same way again.